Hello, everyone. So we're going to start our final session today, which are the flash talks. So each presentation will be 5 minutes, and if we have time, then we will have questions at the end. So first to go is Rebecca Baker, and Rebecca's a master's graduate from the University of Exeter, and her presentation is Towards Interspecies Solidarity, Perceptions of Canine-Human Relations in Conservation Detection Teams.
Hi everyone, my name's Rebecca and my talk is titled Towards Interspecies Solidarity, Perceptions of Canine-Human Relations in Conservation Detection Teams. I'm sure many of us are aware that dogs and their various roles in society have been well documented in academic work. However, when first reading around this topic, I found there are few anthropological perspectives of wildlife or conservation scent detection. This is a fairly novel scientific methodology whereby dog-human teams are tasked with sniffing out data that is collected for ecological research. This data might consist of anything from scat from a threatened species to invasive plants. Much of the existing discourse surrounding this emerging scientific field focuses on the effectiveness or success of the methodology, or more specifically, the suitability of the individual dog working on a given project. Of course, while it might be important for research to demonstrate how these detection teams offer many benefits to wildlife conservation, there's been less emphasis on the lived experiences of dogs doing detection work and their working lives, and ultimately what this means for their enjoyment, fulfillment, and well-being. The study aimed to offer an insight into the experiences of those undertaking this work through analysing the perceptions and observations of humans working in conservation detection teams alongside their canine co-workers to examine whether these partnerships work in a way that may be considered mutually beneficial to both dogs and humans. This research aims to provide some benefit by centering the lived experiences of working dogs in the discussion, as opposed to their value being determined by the success of the specific work they're undertaking. I decided to explore this through an eco-feminist theoretical framework with particular emphasis on the concept of interspecies solidarity introduced by Kendra Coulter, which fosters empathy, support, dignity, and respect in shared multi-species work. Some of the key concepts and points I wanted to focus on included the history of working dogs, training methods, and domestication more generally, language use and its significance, and the day-to-day care and well-being of dogs taking part in this work. My methodology involved interviewing humans who work alongside their canine co-workers from various active conservation detection teams. The participants took part in one-on-one semi-structured interviews, which were then transcribed and analysed. I feel it's important to acknowledge at this stage the limitations of my research as a result of not directly incorporating any canine participants when they make up half of the partnerships in these teams. This is something I was aware of throughout, and as I'll mention later, I hope to be able to expand on in the future. I found throughout the interview discussions that comments emerged from my research that overlapped with some of the concepts set out in the theoretical framework. I'll highlight a few of the key points in the time that I have. Participants spoke of the significance of their partnership and working together as a team, and described the bond and connection they felt with their canine partner, some saying they struggled to put this into words. Comments were also raised regarding the importance of treating dogs doing this work as individuals and recognising the different needs they may each have, as well as offering them freedom and choice during their work, and understanding when they may choose not to partake in it at all. Some of the more traditional and often more problematic or welfare compromise methods used in working dog industries were highlighted, both past and present, and many suggested their philosophies involved a movement away from this in their current work, through decisions in training, offering dogs choice in their communication, and alternative care and housing methods. There were discussions of language. For example, in existing literature regarding conservation detection teams, it's been commonplace to refer to dogs as it. Equally, discussions were had around the use of conservation or wildlife detection dogs or utilising them, as opposed to working together or alongside one another. It also identified the choice of language some participants used to describe themselves, some choosing not to relate to the word handler or trainer, as well as dogs they're working with, referring to them as teammates, colleagues, or co-workers. Overall, several of the comments raised by participants shared similarities with the foundations set out by Coulter's concept of interspecies solidarity, such as respect and dignity, and also suggested further useful additions such as trust and mutual understanding and communication. These themes have also been recognised in research on other canine-human partnerships. My goal with this research project was to better understand and try to improve the individual lives of dogs who work in conservation and working dogs more generally, and examine whether this specific work could be framed as interspecies solidarity. Additional research would be necessary and important to further centre the lives of working dogs in this work, for example through ethnographic research, as well as taking into account other contributing factors such as cultural and geographical influences. There are also discussions of the significance of adopting dogs from shelters and rescues to contribute to this shared work, which may be beneficial to explore. feel the project offered a useful insight into the benefit of applying an anthropological lens to the emerging field of canine-human work in wildlife conservation. And overall, it proposes a call to acknowledge and respect canines for the valuable role that they play in important environmental and conservation research. I hope that it can contribute towards the developing recognition of shared multi-species work where equal value and recognition is prioritised and more than human animals are given freedom of choice and agency in their work alongside humans. Finally, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my supervisor Jess and tutor Fenella for their support, as well as the human participants in my research and their canine teammates. Thank you for listening, and thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Rebecca. Really interesting. So our next speaker will be Marzana Tasnim, and she's a master's graduate from University of Glasgow, and she will be speaking about street dogs in Dhaka, coexistence and conflict in a contested city.
Hi everyone, I'm Marzana, and today I'll be talking about a research I conducted during my master's degree at the University of Glasgow. My research was about how the street dogs of Dhaka, which is the capital of a tiny country in South Asia called Bangladesh, coexist alongside their human neighbors despite various layers of conflict. Now, Dhaka has about 40,000 street dogs who have lived alongside humans for generations, but their relationship with people is often tense. These dogs are routinely relocated, informally harmed, or even culled. So I asked two questions in my research. How can humans coexist? How can dogs and humans coexist more peacefully in Dhaka? And what are the cultural, spatial, and political economic challenges that make this coexistence difficult? To answer these, I used a qualitative approach. I carried out semi-structured interviews and focus group discussions with people who had varied levels of relationships with street dogs. I spoke with both animal welfare activists and ordinary residents. I also analyzed cultural texts, religious references, and media reports, just to understand how these dogs have been positioned and politicized over time. I then used thematic analysis to identify patterns in the data. I did a whole work virtually, which wasn't easy because it pushed me to be more flexible and to draw from diverse fields for a fuller picture. What I found was quite a layered story. First of all, fear of dogs often started in childhood. Kids grew up hearing myths like the idea that a dog bite could make you pregnant with puppies. And seeing these dogs in their natural urban habitat near trash or being dirty or unruly also shaped how these kids viewed these dogs later in their own lives. Religion played an interestingly complicated role here as well. Islam, which is the dominant faith in Bangladesh, has many teachings on kindness towards animals, but certain hadiths are taken out of context or politicized to legitimize hostility. In those cases, religion becomes less about faith itself and more about power. Secondly, cruelty isn't always about dogs. It can reflect frustration with poverty, overcrowding, overheating, or lack of green spaces. And dogs, unfortunately, become an outlet for that frustration. Finally, there's a sense of ambivalence when it comes to the street dogs of Dhaka. The same dog who is being fed in one moment can often be found being chased in another. And that puts these dogs in a sort of in-between status, where they're both part of the city and somehow not really part of it, which mirrors bigger questions of who belongs in urban life and who doesn't. So these dogs then are not just background figures. They reveal how economics, politics, and culture all come together in human-animal relationships. So what does that mean, then, for sharing space fairly? What my research suggests is that, first of all, we have to accept that humans and dogs are already entangled. They're part of the city, whether we like it or not. So we have to fix the narratives. We have to look at the hostility that in the stories we tell, and we we have to change it through awareness. We have to replace it with facts and then truth. Cruelty also often reflects bigger pressures like poverty, overcrowding, and lack of green space. And fixing those means a better, fairer space, both for humans and non-humans. And of course, we need policies, human population management for non-human neighbors, and chances for dogs and humans to actually interact. However, all that being said, my research isn't the full story. I didn't observe the dogs in their natural habitat. Most of my research participants were already connected to animal welfare. And to go further, I would need more perspectives from everyday residents and some stronger data, surveys, and numbers to build solid policy recommendations. With that being said, I want to leave you with a question. If Dhaka's dogs, despite culling, cruelty, and neglect, continue to insist on their place in the city, what does that tell us about who really belongs in urban life and on what terms? I'd be happy to ramble on about this, so please feel free to connect. My contact info is on the screen. Thank you for your time. It's already 15 seconds past, so.
Thank you, Marzana. Yes, I'm sure many of us would be happy to ramble on about that topic as well. Excellent. Okay, our next speaker is Saskia Smith, who's a master's graduate from KU Leuven. And her topic is, can the mounted animal stand up for itself on mounted objects and animal ontologies? There is a content warning for this. Marzana has said the content may be mildly disturbing and could be sensitive to some viewers.
Hi everyone, my name is Saskia Smith. I'm pre-recording this video in Brussels, and yeah, I'm going to attempt to unpack a few elements of my anthropological research which I conducted at the University of Leuven. Before I continue, a quick disclaimer. So my presentation will contain a visual essay of my fieldwork amongst taxidermy displays, which will probably be like behind me right now. There will be no like blood or explicit images of carcasses, but some still may find the notion or just like the display of taxidermy slightly uncanny or unsettling. So initially this research emerged from a deceptively simple question. How do we in our Western society commonly conceptualize animals? What sort of assumptions do we rely on when we think of them? And at first, this may seem like a very simple, straightforward question, but it's actually very difficult to ask because there are so many deeply ingrained, taken for granted, assumptions that need to be disrupted in order to really get a clear view on how our culture conceptualizes animals. Anthropology really reminds us that there are so many different cultural perspectives and that different societies have different ways of conceptualizing their world. So, for example, indigenous Amerindian peoples, they conceptualize animals more as like spiritual beings, or beings charged with a certain spiritual significance. For us, we sort of render them more as biological entities, and they have a different socio-material meaning, basically. So within this sort of Western framework, idea of an animal is very much dominated by a taxonomical thinking, by biological narrative. And the question, what is an animal to us, was made more tangible in my research by really turning to the way in which animals are commonly portrayed, or how they are commonly reproduced, or how representations are reproduced to sort of attend to this notion of an animal. So this led me to examine the material culture of taxidermy, because we very often assume that taxidermy is the most realistic representation of an animal. This is very interesting for me because as we sort of conflate the notion of a real living animal with a mounted specimen, there's this really interesting, very problematic anthropocentric paradigm that emerges because, we sort of come to understand animals through this objectification process. Rather than really recognizing them as beings with agency, with movement, with life cycles, with their own relationships, with their own distinct modes of presence, with their embeddedness within an environment, within a network of relations, we sort of reduce this idea of animals to a static and knowable form. And animals, we sort of condition that way of looking at animals through attending to mounted representations. So taxidermy also really facilitates this notion that humans should assume the role of an observer, of the classifier, of the dominator, of the all-knowing. In a way, taxidermy also favors the human in a position of oversight and, even superiority. And that's why sort of we very easily construct a humanist binary between animal and human through sort of this process of objectification, through objectifying the animal. So that's, in a nutshell, sort of what I was researching. But I also responded to this problematic binary by unfolding a visual essay which really tried to experiment with new ways of framing animals that gradually unsettle this realism in taxidermy. I really tried to tap into more like abstract or artistic modes of representation, sometimes also pushing towards something uncanny or indeterminate. And exploring forms of hybridity amongst species, drawing relations, and creating hybrid compositions. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think it just ended short then. That wasn't me cutting her off.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks to Saskia also for highlighting the problematic issues of mounted representations. That was a very interesting presentation. So next we have Regina Kóti. Regina, I apologise if I pronounced your name incorrectly. She's a PhD student at the University of Szeged, and her presentation is from anthropomorphisation to haptic animal cinema, the possibility of animal representation in contemporary moving images. Thank you, Regina.
So welcome everyone. My name is Regina Kóti, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here in my presentation from Anthropomorphisation to Haptic Animal Cinema. I will introduce my first year PhD research. And somehow I can't change the slides. Finally, okay. So in my research, I'm interested in how animals can be represented in moving image through new strategies that go beyond anthropomorphism. We know anthropomorphism means attributing human qualities to animal, and it's deeply rooted in our visual traditions. But what I see problematic with this mode of representation is animals can lose their own characteristics and become metaphors for human experiences, and as a result, viewers mostly recognize themselves rather than the animals as such. And I think in these times of crisis, it's crucial to develop new non-anthropocentric representational systems that do not judge everything from a perspective of humans, but instead respect the autonomy and alterity of animals. And the key question of my research is, through which cinematic innovations can this be achieved? My corpus included fiction and documentary films and many other genres. And in the background, we see Andrea Arnold's movie Cow. Talking about Cow, the director admitted she wanted to show a non-human consciousness. But my first impression was that anthropomorphism remains very hard to avoid. And Arnold's cinematic language was innovative in how, yet the film often slipped back into anthropomorphization. For example, when Luma gazing at airplanes or hot air balloon, which can easily be read as something like a profound longing of a heroine from a sentimental novel, let's say. But I'm interested in how can we understand animals better through moving image. So I've investigated the other possibilities of animal representation. One approach I call traumatizing imagery is the case and of most of the vegan or animal rights movies, and they depict suffering and factory farming. And despite these films' narrative, visually animals are portrayed in value-laden ways. We always see the animals as something, as food, as instruments, or as resources. And second is new media art, that I will not explain now. And what I found most exciting is haptic visuality that can emphasizes the singularity and intrinsic value of animals and has the ability to avoid projecting human meaning onto them. And we can see the animals in a different way. So my framework was based on this latter one. And as Laura Marx said, in haptic visuality, the eyes themselves function like organs of touch. It is more inclined to move than to focus, more inclined to grace than to gaze. And examples for these cinematic techniques that can provoke this sensory interpret, see these animals in a different way, and acknowledging that they will always remain partly unknowable. And finalizing the ethical outcomes, and I would say the results of my PhD research, my theoretical PhD research, this mode of visual representation realizes what Leslie Paul Thiele called releasement, that means connecting without seeking to fully possess or interpret animals through human categories. Instead, these films foster a deep, non-totalizing form of understanding. And I believe haptic visuality evokes the sense of interconnectedness, which according to transpersonal ecology can spontaneously generate care and responsibility. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Regina. That was fascinating and so good to be talking about different ways of seeing. So thank you very much. Now I hand over to Jill. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, we've got another 4 flash talks to listen to. So the first one is from, and you'll have to accept my apologies if I mispronounce your name, Surabhi Baijal, a master's graduate from Ambedkar University, looking at mortal love and moral injury, the effective costs of care harm in animal experimentation. Thanks.
Hi everyone. So I don't have a presentation. My name is Surabhi. I just finished a master's in environment and development from Ambedkar University, Delhi in India. And this work came out of a paper that I read during a gender and environment course that I did. The name of the paper is Mortal Love and Moral Injury, the Effective Costs of Care Harm in Animal Experimentation. Animal experimentation is not simply a technical matter of science. It is also an effective ethical existential paradox. The same people who feed, clean, and comfort laboratory animals, who learn their quirks, who soothe them when they are frightened, are the very ones who must inject them, wound them, and ultimately kill them. This paradox has been captured by sociologist Tora Homburg through the phrase mortal love. She shows that care and violence do not stand apart in the laboratory. Instead, they cohabit the same embodied space. Hollenberg's research reveals something striking. Many technicians and researchers present themselves as animal lovers. They describe their work in terms of friendship and guardianship. Some call themselves animal police, insisting that their role is to ensure that rules are followed and animals are kept safe until the end. They talk about favorite species, the way rabbits become companions, or rats develop personalities that feel almost human. They give animals names and sometimes even treat them as theirs, much like pets at home. These are not casual metaphors, they express genuine attachment. But this attachment makes the act of killing harder, not easier. Workers talk about killing well, making sure death is quick, quiet, and dignified. They close doors to block noise, place familiar bedding inside a gas chamber, cover the box with a jacket to reduce stress, or opt for methods that minimize visible suffering. These practices are framed as professional standards, but they are also small embodied gestures of compassion. To care for an animal and then to kill that same animal requires emotional labor of a particular kind. This is where the notion of moral injury becomes important. Moral injury describes a psychic wound that occurs when people participate in, witness, or are unable to prevent actions that violate their deeply held values. Unlike burnout, which is about exhaustion, moral injury is about betrayal, a betrayal of the self or of one's ethical commitments. In the laboratory context, moral injury manifests as guilt, shame, or unease that cannot be fully rationalized away. Institutional routines attempt to manage this burden. Killing is sometimes rotated among staff. Senior workers may shoulder more responsibilities, sparing newcomers. Scientific language reframes animals as models, samples, or even waste. These strategies dull the edge of distress, but they do not erase it. Instead, they embedded the contradiction into the very structure of laboratory life. People learn to live with the dissonance, but the dissonance leaves traces. Seen through the feminist ethics of care and affect theory, this situation becomes even clearer. Care is not just a principle, it is embodied in touch, in routines, in speech. Hollenberg argues that emotions of love and dependency and empathy are not simply justifications for harm. They are intrinsic to the possibility of harm. To harm well, one must first care well. To produce reliable scientific results, animal must be tended to, soothed, kept healthy, and then killed at precisely the right moment. The paradox is not an anomaly, it is the structure. When we added moral injury to this picture, we can see human cost. Laboratory workers are not just professionals, they are moral subjects shaped by their actions. Every act of affection that precedes an act of killing intensifies the wound. Every joke that masks discomfort, even routines that spread responsibility, is a way of coping with unresolved ethical pain. Empathy in this system is both required and betrayed. My argument here is not to offer simple resolution or to condemn individuals who work in these spaces. Rather, it is to highlight the hidden cost of systems that demand people both love and harm at once. Animal experimentation injures not only the animals, but also the humans who carry it out. It asks them to internalize contradictions, to absorb psychic burdens, and to continue despite the scars. Reframing the laboratory in this way, as not only a site of science, but also an emotional crucible, allows us to ask deeper questions. What does it mean to be responsible for beings we must care for and destroy? What happens to empathy when it is made into a tool of scientific control? How far can experimental reason stretch before it fractures the very people who enact it? Mortal love gives us language for the paradox, care and violence intertwined. Moral injury gives us language for its consequences, the scars left on moral subjectivity. Together, they point to the need for greater recognition of the effective costs borne by those who labor in spaces of sanctioned violence. Recognizing this does not weaken science. It makes visible the cost at which science is sustained, and it opens the possibility of imagining different futures where care does not have to be bound to harm. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to our next flash talk, and this is Nikhil God, PhD student at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And it's Fleshing Out the Animal Other in Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow. Okay, Nikhil, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Nikhil, and the title of my presentation is Fleshing the Animal Other in Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow. For those of you who are not familiar with it, The Day After Tomorrow is a Hollywood catastrophe film, which is essentially a very Hollywood genre film. But what this talk does is to use speculative visual anthropology to somehow reorient the ways in which the film presents a climate catastrophe environment in ways that we can think about animal lives and non-human human relationality in a broader sense than what is presented through the anthropomorphized narrative of the film. So the day after tomorrow inverts many of our considerations of climate change to include freezing, blizzards, and the general chilling of the environment. I find this film particularly important for discussion because unlike other narratives of climate catastrophe and also many of our lived realities of heat waves, extreme bulk temperatures, the general notion of freezing, chilling, and blizzard is, is not present in our consideration. My methodology is, as I said, speculative visual anthropology, which allows for critical consideration of cultural text and visual media as representative of our collective thought. Enmeshed within the film's narrative of a father-son reunion also lies a consideration for non-human animal lives, where while the volatility of climate disrupts modern human life, it allows for unique settings for particular non-human animals to thrive. In the film, we see wolves who escape their cages and find the weather much more palpable to their existence, are able to roam, scourge, and attain an agency that does not exist for them in the normative heating world. Akira Lippert in Electric Animals, towards the rhetoric of wildlife, notes that animals in modernity established and yet are excluded from the plenitude of nature. What the film does is to foreground this ubiquitous nature of the non-human animal and their existence, one which allows us to speculate on the ways in which not humans but also non-human animals might deal with weather and climate volatility. Since the film creates the conditions of a purported ice age within our living Anthropocene, it is imperative to use this as a way of thinking how non-human agency might take charge within these situations. While the narrative restricts itself to its human characters, they can imagine the reemergence of mammoths, the saber-toothed tiger, American cheetah, among others, during this supposedly ice age condition. What does this mean for non-human animal relationality within their own family histories? How does the big cat and the small cat deal with relations between not only existing families of uh, biological families, but also re-emerging due to climate volatility? The day after tomorrow doesn't go there, but we should, as people within the midst of ever-changing environments, think about these through speculation. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to present. That is it.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. That was really interesting. Okay, we're going to move on now. Victoria Mitchell, master's graduate from the University of Exeter, and Victoria's talk is Don't Feed the Gulls, Signage, Pest Narratives and Urban Gull Control.
Thank you. Today I'm Victoria, and I've been looking at signs in mainly seaside towns around Don't Feed the Gulls. So I'm doing a snapshot of that today, looking at how the signs link to pest narratives and urban gull control. It's just a small trigger warning that I will touch upon lethal methods of gull control, but it's just a brief mention. There's no imagery or detail. So just for information or clarity, because there are many types of gulls, in a UK context, and especially in England where I've looked, urban gull typically refers to herring gulls and lesser black gulls. And you'll see a lot in the media and in local council websites that this is a recent phenomenon, but actually evidence suggests that gulls have been in our towns and cities for over a century. And although in everyday language we may contrast the urban gull with her counterpart, the rural gull, Natural England used the term natural nesting to differentiate between the two. And we may ask, well, why should we care what Natural England think? They are a public body in England who license actions affecting protected wildlife, including gulls, and they also produce research to inform policy at both the local and national government level. And they decide how many urban gulls there are and where they are. So understanding how they understand urban is quite important. And we can see that they firmly tie the idea of urban to artifice. If we take Knight's observation that if pestilence is crime, then pest control becomes law enforcement, then local authorities have become the sheriffs. They've got no statutory duty to control gulls at all, but many of them have certainly chosen to do so historically. So early enforcement often meant death, although local authority ability to carry out culls was restricted by the 1981 Wildlife and Country Act and further modifications. And today, local authorities produce a variety of methods of gull control. For our local authority sheriffs, however, reality and expectation are rarely aligned. And there's strong evidence to suggest that these methods are ineffective and have been ineffective. And I think that Rock illustrated this nicely when he points out that fewer than 1% of urban gulls naturally recruit, that's join traditional colonies, so ones at sea or in fields, and that this rate does not increase for those forced to abandon their nests. So in recent years, local authorities have attempted to look beyond gull behaviour and have redirected their focus towards monitoring and managing the behaviour of human residents when it comes to policing gull presence. And they've done this through two key ways. That has been regulatory signage and promotional campaigns, and also the introduction of public spaces protection orders, which actually use the criminal law, the Crime and Policing Act 2014, to issue fixed penalty notices, and it actually does make it a criminal offence. So we're going to look at two slides. The first one is St Ives, and I've chosen St Ives because I think that they illustrate one way of approaching gull management. We can see here this is a series of signs produced by St Ives Town Council and St Ives Business Information District, and I've included some quotes on here from the town council and from the launch of the posters, which I think sort of feeds into the ethos of how they look at them and how they try to adopt a conciliatory approach. They're very brightly coloured signs. They contain a cartoon-style gull, and her body takes up most of the sign, and the wording is on that. So it keeps it going forward. So it teaches us beware the gulls. And then in a series of kind of maybe humorous and perhaps conciliatory recognition that the gulls are indeed the locals in one of the signs, it goes on to give us that information. And there's a suggestion of a link between human interaction or feeding and bad gull behaviour is repeated on each sign, which has don't feed them, don't teach them. And so we'll move on to another council, which is Lyme Regis Town Council. And they have a more naturalistic looking sign. There's a gull here who is a photograph of a gull bobbing on the water, and she is speaking directly to us saying, please don't feed me. And we shouldn't feed her because it is bad for her and it's bad for us, she tells us. Now, Dorset Council has a PSPO in place in Lyme Regis and West Bay, and you can be issued with a fixed penalty notice for feeding birds there. It's one of the only 6 councils in England to do so. And there we have a quote from the town council, which is very different to the St Ives kind of one, which is saying that about the dangers of seagulls. And on this next slide, I've shown some other seagull signs that I found, and there's often a mixed approach. Sometimes they'll use a more naturalistic looking seagull, and sometimes a cartoon seagull, and sometimes, as we can see in the case of Linton and Lynmouth, no seagull at all. Local authority signs, both produce and reinforce recurring motifs and narrative that tell us a story about the urban girl. And these have real material effects for her. They are aimed at removing her from human spaces. And Carr and Reyes Galdino turn the stories the media, other actors and stakeholders create about animals as cultural imaginaries. And I think there's a quote from Councillor Dorney of Lyme Regis Town Council that just illustrates this. In a council meeting, he was talking about how they could communicate how bad the girls were. And he said, we should put signs on the railings in the seafront with pictures of girls taking ice cream from babies in prams. So we saw earlier that Natural England have linked the idea of urban to artifice. And I've tried to illustrate that the idea of artifice has been co-opted by local authorities to communicate with their residents about goals and the danger of goals. Looking at the signs and the language and the themes used, we can certainly come to feel that the terms urban and natural contain value judgments about space, place, and belonging. Using urban as a qualifier almost suggests that urban goals are set apart from other goals. The urban girl is out of place living in the city. She is not where nature belongs. Local authorities link problematic bird behaviour with unnaturalness and situate the cause of this within the dynamic of the human-bird encounter. Individuals who feed the birds are co-conspirators who enable or lure the bird into unnatural acts. The girl is at once victim and offender. And this rarefies our social construction of the urban girl as unnatural and aims to limit the possibilities of encounter. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. That was great. Okay, we're going to move on to the next talk. This is Libby Hooper. I'm not sure that Libby's here. So this is a recording. Libby Hooper is a bachelor's graduate from the University of Cambridge, and the title is The Bitches Barking Back, Exploring Experiences of Stigma and Resistance Among Women in the UK Animal Rights Movement.
Hi everybody, I'm Libby and my talk today is based on my undergraduate dissertation and is entitled The Bitches Barking Back, Exploring Experiences of Stigma and Resistance Amongst Women in the UK Animal Rights Movement. So my project explored how women in the UK animal rights movement are treated in daily life due to their animal advocacy and their human-animal bonds and affections. Now, I'm sure that many of you here are familiar with the gendered labels of the crazy cat lady or the horse girl, and how there is a distinctly gendered mockery of affection toward non-human animals. So I was interested in the positioning of female animal rights activists who face backlash on account of their gender, the cause that they advocate for, and their assumed over-emotionality. In terms of methodology, this was a qualitative project, and this was important as much of the research focused on individual feelings, narratives, and experiences, and interviews allowed participants to flesh out their opinions and insights more thoroughly. So all of my participants recalled facing stigmatization due to their animal advocacy and their perceived emotional and symbolic proximity to the non-human. All participants also connected the stigma to their gender. This manifested through participants highlighting how the negative reactions they've received for their advocacy primarily came from men. Others have discussed how the insulting language they'd encountered during their advocacy was distinctly gendered, from being called a bitch to more implicit feminized epithets such as being called irrational or hysterical, positioning them in direct opposition to the rational and masculine realm of science. Trivialization of activists and their cause was another common theme. For example, one of my participants was dismissed as just being a fluffy softie, and many shared this frustration that their bond with the non-human was trivialized, undermining their ethical beliefs, passions, and commitments to the cause. Common throughout all these experiences was the attempted hyperfeminization and animalization of the activists and their cause, drawing on dualisms wherein these activists were aligned with the feminine as opposed to the masculine, the animal as opposed to the human, and the emotional as opposed to the rational, with these alignments inherently making them appear inferior. So this has painted quite a negative picture. However, while all of my participants had experienced stigma, when asked, they also all stated that in their daily lives they felt more empowered by their activism than stigmatized, and that the positives outweighed the negatives. So a popular stigma resistance strategy was epistemic reframing. This is where participants embraced the terms that were being used to put them down, for example, reclaiming the crazy cat lady label and framing the perceived over-emotionality of these women in the movement as a positive, as it meant they were seen as empathetic and caring. So they used the rhetoric that was used to insult them, but shifted its meaning. Homing in on feelings of empowerment was another strategy of overcoming stigma, as participants discussed how finding community through advocacy made them feel as though they didn't need to be ashamed of their affection toward non-human animals, instead taking pride in this affection and finding strength in being surrounded by other activists. Some even stated that their activism made them feel heard and as though they could stand up for themselves, which was seen to counter the broader rhetoric which casts these activists as weak or softies. Finally, participants emphasized their focus on the bigger picture, noting that their activism was worth continuing despite the stigma due to its potential to achieve interspecies liberation. Participants described that although their activism yielded stigma in the short term, it has the capacity to result in a longer-term overhaul of patriarchal, anthropocentric, and rationalist societal norms, resulting in liberation for non-human animals, women, and other minoritized communities. So finding optimism in this radical, liberated future rendered their stigma almost meaningless in the face of this broader struggle. To conclude, this study explored the material, positive and negative impacts of the perceivedly abnormal human-animal bond amongst women in the UK animal rights movement. And in an optimistic sense, it revealed that the positives of their advocacy and the strength that they find in their affection toward non-human animals overpowered the negatives, giving them the tools and the power to bark back against the negative stereotypes and stigma deployed against them. This quote from one of my participants really sums up this attitude of human and animal liberation being entwined. So to finish off, here are some of my own non-human family members. If you have any questions, comments, if you'd like to read the paper, please do just get in touch. I'd love to keep in contact with all of you. You can find me on any of these platforms. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.